Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for Sweet Life. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today I've got a chocolate project for you, which after cookie projects, chocolate projects have to be some of my most favorite to do. This one's also extra special because not only does it look like a patriotic firecracker, perfect for a 4th of July party, it's also got a surprise filling of mousse and berries inside. So let's talk about what you'll need. Let's start first with the edible elements that go into this project. Basically, you need chocolate of 3 colors, red, white, and blue. And for this project, it's very important to use a compound or coating chocolate, one that doesn't need tempering but sets up firm and crisp just after it's melted. Or you need to temper real chocolate. Other edible elements we'll be using are these store-bought cookie sticks. These form the tail of the rocket, which I discovered the tail of the rocket, the stick that sticks out of the end, actually keeps the firecracker shooting straight. I never knew that. So those will be stuck on the end. They'll be further accessorized with some little sugar beads, and I'll be trimming out some pieces with modeling chocolate. This has also been made with the same compound chocolate as I'm using to make some of the other pieces of the rocket. As for the inedible elements, there are a few you need to shape the rocket. First, you need a cone mold, literally shaped like a cone. This is going to form the nozzle of the rocket, and I believe this is about 1.5 inches in diameter across the top. This will be used to shape the nozzle, as I said, in 2 colors of chocolate. Then we need a contraption for shaping the cylinder. I've got a piece of styrofoam and just a simple piece of plastic piping that I sanitized. Got it at the hardware store and sanitized it for this purpose. We'll be wrapping the chocolate around it. This too is about 1.5 inches in diameter. Then we need something very straightforward. We're going to be using actually cookie cutters, not to make cookies, but as molds to create little chocolate discs that will top the cylinder and also cap it off at the bottom so that we can enclose mousse inside. We'll be pouring the chocolate into those onto acetate. We also need some spare acetate and a trussing needle to make some marbled chocolate effects for the fire coming out of the end of the rocket. It'll look something like this. We'll be doing one big marbled piece and cutting it into sections. And then lastly, we need some frosting sheets and some craft paper punches. I've got stars here to make some patriotic patterns on the cylinders. We'll be stenciling onto the cylinders to create that silvery star effect, and we'll be using frosting sheets as the actual stencil. So I've got my red chocolate melted. I'm going to start by making the nozzles, and the red goes down first in those. Just as a note about melting chocolate, either real chocolate or compound chocolate, it melts the same way. If you don't have a microwave, I do it in a double boiler over very, very low heat. If you get it too hot, it will seize and get very thick and hard to pipe, and you want it flowing very fluidly like so. And I am using my piping bag so I can really focus the chocolate in the bottom, ideally without dripping any on the sides. I'm just going to do a few here so we get the idea. And before the red chocolate is completely set, this will set really quickly at room temperature. You want to get the white in there. These are small enough pieces that if someone were to bite into it and get solid chocolate, I think it would be quite agreeable. So I'm just filling all the way to the top here. This chocolate's a little thicker, you can see tracks in it, than my red, so I might have gotten it a little bit hotter than my red in the melting process, but it should be fine. I'm just going to again, tap it flat, make sure things look good from the side. And then that will set nicely at room temperature, though these are big pieces and solid chocolate pieces. It may take a while to set at room temperature. Okay, so the next piece we're going to make are the discs. These 1.5 inch discs that sit at either the tail end or the nozzle end of the rocket. The nozzle end is going to go together something like this, and the tail end will be a little bit more complicated. I'm going to do the white one first, and then we'll come back and do a red one. I've got that same white chocolate that I had melted for the tops of the cones, and I'm just piping into this. I want this about, maybe 3/16 of an inch thick, not quite 1/4 of an inch, and not as thin as 1/8 of an inch, just because I want to see it and I don't want it to be super delicate. I am going to give this a tap on the countertop to level out the chocolate. I don't worry too much if the chocolate isn't level on the surface now, because once it's set, I can level it out later so there's a nice tight fit between these pieces. But a gentle tap will flatten a lot of it out, particularly if the chocolate's pretty soft and nicely flowing to start. That too will set up at room temperature, not tempered because I'm using a coating chocolate, but I'm going to accelerate the process of setting that in the fridge as well, and you'll see how easily that pops out after a couple of minutes. This will take much less time to set than the big cone because the chocolate isn't as deep. And now I'm going to do another red one here just to give you an idea. Working on a parchment lined cardboard, just piping the chocolate in. This is a little more fluid, so it's flowing nicely to the edge of the, I want to make sure the entire cookie cutter is filled so you get a nice round disc. And it's, the more fluid the chocolate is, the more likely or more easily it does that. So I've got a cardboard here to give this some stability to make it easier to transport to the fridge to set up, and a piece of acetate again on top to create a really shiny effect. And I'm just going to pipe kind of a really rough triangle with the red. We don't need these super long. I think that's long enough. That might be 3 inches long. I'm going to give it a shake so it settles out. And then I'm going to take my white chocolate with the tip maybe open a 1/16 of an inch. It's really fluid chocolate, so it's going to spread a lot when it hits the red chocolate, which is okay. I'm going to just pipe some stripes across it, and then we're going to draw a trussing needle through them to create this sort of marbled fire effect. So that looks pretty good. And to marble it, again, just take a trussing needle or a toothpick and draw it through as much as you want. I like drawing them in an outward direction so it looks like the flames are shooting backwards. Some of these fine pieces here might break when we lift it off, but we'll be careful and try not to break them because they do lend to a nice sort of fiery effect. Now this can go into the fridge to set up as well. It will set up, of course, at room temperature. You can also set these in the freezer. That'll accelerate the process even faster. So the pieces that should be quickest to set are the thin discs. They will set very, very fast, and you'll know it. They'll literally just slip right out of the cookie cutter. Cookie cutters weren't greased, nothing special done to them. Same here. These pieces can all be made in advance as well, and the assembly can be done closer to the event if you'd like. If you're going to do that, just store them in airtight containers at room temperature in a cool environment. And I'm just going to take a knife that I warmed up by running it through a flame on my burner and just cut these into slightly smaller pieces. You don't have to do this, but I like having the smaller pieces. It gives me a little more flexibility when I arrange the tail of the rocket. So there we've got a nice fiery piece. And there's a little roughness here. You can see a little residual chocolate on the acetate. That's because these are probably slightly soft. I could have let them set a little bit longer, but they work just fine, and they'll set up more fully as they sit here on this plate. I had these actually in the freezer to accelerate the process, and you'll know if they're ready to come out if you press on them, and they should be firm to the touch. There might be some slight separation from the sides of the mold, and the true test is just to turn it over, wrap them on the counter, and see if they pop out. If they don't, then you want to set them back in for more setting time. But they're falling out nicely on their own without any wrapping on the counter, so they're completely set. Essentially what I'm going to be doing is spreading the blue chocolate on a piece of acetate and then wrapping it around the cylinder and then removing the chocolate once it's set from the cylinder. However, I don't want to wrap the chocolate directly onto this plastic cylinder because it will not disengage from the plastic. It needs an additional lining material on it. So I am going to line it with a bit of parchment paper, and this will make it easier to disengage the chocolate later. So how do we get this parchment slip around and have it stay in place? I am going to adhere it to itself with a little bit of shortening. And I'm just going to take a dab of shortening, and I'm not putting the shortening on the cone, on this plastic cylinder itself. I'm putting it on the parchment paper, because if I stick the parchment paper to the plastic with shortening, I'm going to have a hard time getting the paper out afterwards, and it needs to come out. I'm going to put a pretty generous spoon on top because I want this not to be too fragile. I want it, it'll end up about 1/8 of an inch thick. if I do it properly. Any thinner than that, and it can be difficult to get the cylinder off the cone. This is the trickiest part of the project. You just have to use a really light touch. So I spread my chocolate over it pretty nicely and evenly. But I've gone over the edge of it, and you want to do that. But before it sets, you want to get the edge of your acetate and move it over to a clean area. Find that edge of the acetate. I'm using my trussing needle to find it. And then just move this over to a clean area, kind of drag it and out of chocolate, because you need to be able to lift it up later. And you don't want any chocolate or very little chocolate on the back of the acetate. Now we're just going to let it sit there until it's partially set. You'll notice the chocolate beginning to get less shiny or beginning to crack. And once it's reached that stage, we're going to lift it up and wrap it around the cylinder, trying to match up the seam of the chocolate on the acetate with the seam of the paper. Okay, I think I'm going to attempt to wrap it. The other key test, you just want to grab the very slightest, the very tips of the corners, is that it shouldn't drain when you pick it up, and it's not draining. I'm going to try to match up the back of the chocolate with the seam of the parchment paper, as I mentioned before, and then pull it as taut as I can all the way around. If you get a little chocolate on the parchment paper liner, it's not a big deal. So unlike when I do my chocolate cake wraps, when I'm wrapping onto a cold cake, the chocolate likes to cling to it, but here I'm wrapping onto a room temperature cylinder, so you'll see that the wrap likes to kind of disengage and not completely wrap around. It likes to pop open, I should say. So I'm just going to prop it with something tall enough to keep it closed until it completely sets up. So I could have waited a little bit longer. There's some drainage out the bottom, which typically I don't get if I wait a little bit longer, but I think it'll be okay. We're going to set that in the fridge now, just until it's set, and then we'll disengage it from the cylinder. Okay, so this is ready to have the acetate removed, and the way I can tell is that it's chilled up enough that I'm seeing some separation of the chocolate from the acetate here. You see these little kind of whiter, less blue areas. That means it's beginning to disengage. Okay, before we take the acetate off, I want to make sure any of this drippage down here is removed, because that can sometimes pull off break the chocolate behind it if it's not removed, and it should chip away pretty easily. Now, if I were to pull this acetate out completely now, I'd probably break the chocolate. So what I want to do is score down along the seam so I can get all the chocolate off the top, so I can remove that acetate. So be very gentle here, just scoring gradually down along the seam. You can see where the seam is. There we go. So I got it off. So now that we've got the acetate off, we're going to go ahead and take the parchment paper out from the inside. Before you do that, you want to make sure the bottom of the cylinder is completely clear of chocolate. Any underflow, it'll be hard to get it off the cylinder. That looks nice and clear of chocolate. Sometimes some of the chocolate will lap onto the white, and you want to scrape that off. And then I just simply push on my parchment paper. Then I want to make sure that before I pull the parchment paper out, this paper is completely disengaged on this end. Pull from one end to remove the parchment paper, like so. So these are frosting sheets. They're an edible paper. I'm not going to stick them down completely around it because I want to remove them later. I'm just going to tack them in the back at the seam. So I'm just going to tack it with a little corn syrup at this end. I'm going to cut off the extra here. I definitely don't need all that length. And then just tack it onto the paper here, making sure it's fitting flush to the chocolate all the way around. It's a nice tight fit. I don't see any gaps here, and that's what I'm looking for. Now I want to do that up at the top as well. A dab of corn syrup on here. We don't want too much. It'll be easier to get it off without much on it. You could also leave these plain. So if you want to speed up this process, skip the stenciling. It would be a cool project even without the stencil components. I'm using a craft paper punch to create the stencil. I often do this. And I'm just going to stick it dead center if I can. So that's stuck down pretty well. I don't see any of the edges really lifting. I've got my counter covered and my spray backdrop set up all ready for spritzing this with a little bit of edible luster spray. This is a PME brand. I like it because it dries super quickly, unlike some other brands. Some brands are much wetter, and what happens is it causes the frosting sheet to kind of warp or start to dissolve and lift off the chocolate. So the drier the spray sets and the quicker it sets, the less likely that's going to happen, and you'll get a much cleaner stencil. I'm going to give it a good shake. I've got it elevated so it'll be a little bit easier for me to get low on the cylinder. And I'm going to start in the back, so if there's anything awry with the spray, it'll affect the back and not the front first. Give it a test spray on my counter. And I like to work about 5 inches away from the surface. If you get too close, it'll start to pool up. I'm going to give it a nice coat on the face so I don't have to go back over it, because if you go back over it, sometimes you can lift the frosting sheet stencil. It'll start getting too wet. So we are ready to remove the stencils. You don't want to wait too long before taking off the frosting sheets because the corn syrup can dry and become harder to get them off. And pull carefully at the end where the corn syrup was, because you can sometimes break a little chocolate. That's the back side. And now let's just take off the star on the front. This was not stuck down with corn syrup, so it should come off a heck of a lot easier. I just want to get an edge. Oops, and there we have it. So where this was beginning to lift here, there's a little more of a shadow of some underspray, but I think it looks pretty nice. I'm going to make ribbons as I always do. Again, I've got a whole other video on making ribbons with modeling chocolate too. I like to roll with my pasta machine. I get a nice even roll that way. And I'm going to be rolling to the number 2 or probably the number 3 setting on my pasta machine. I want this fairly thin. I don't want to add too much width to the cylinder because the discs are almost the diameter of the cylinder, and I want them to remain a little bit larger once this is wrapped. Again, I want to see some of that blue stripe. I don't want to cover it all. So I think that's probably thick enough. We'll cut a couple of these in case I stretch this one, getting it up there. So in this case, I do want to stick it down completely with corn syrup so that it doesn't fall off the cylinder, because this piece is going to stay on. It's nice and chocolatey and edible, but I only paint a little bit of corn syrup on at a time and stick it down gradually. Again, starting with the back seam. And before I press it down, I'm just going to eyeball where it's going to connect with the other one, cut it there roughly. At this point, I want to flip it over to get the other side, because it'll be very difficult to lay the fondant without messing up the silver part if I don't flip it. And that looks nice, nicely trimmed out. I'm going to start first with assembling the nozzle because it's the easiest of the two. It's going to go together something like so. And you'll notice on this one here, I've got a really nice tight fit between the nozzle and the disc. And the disc is also very flat on the top and the bottom. That isn't always the case. This is the one I molded this morning. See how rough it is there? And it's not quite as nicely smooth. It'll always be nice on the end that was on the bottom, but the end that was piped may look rough. And we do want to smooth that out so we have the nicest, tightest fit on these cylinders. And to do that, I've got a warm cookie sheet. I'm just going to run that on it until it's flattened out. You don't want to overdo it because you can melt the chocolate a little bit. So in assembling these, I liked the shiny side, the perfect side up and facing outward. And as glue, I'm just using a little bit of the white chocolate that I used earlier. I don't need too much because we don't want it smooshing out, but we do want it making contact with the cone. It appears to be. And I want to get that as centered as possible without handling it too much. And it will eventually set into place at room temperature. Now for the tailpiece, I'm working elevated because I'm going to be building this tall, and I've got 2 discs as well. Both were smooth stovetop, so they fit nicely together. And I'm going to mount the fire to the white piece, and the red piece is going to be closest to the blue cylinder. Just again, a little bit of white chocolate on the inside, and pressing down so they make contact, making sure they're centered side to side and overhead. That looks good. Now to put the fire on top, I am going to use a little bit of that modeling chocolate as an anchor. It'll be easier to keep the chocolate pieces upright. And I want to get that as close to center as possible as well. So then using a little bit of chocolate as glue and then plunging it in, we'll have it standing pretty straight right away. You just want to make sure it is centered. And now I'm going to start laying in my chocolate pieces. I will also try to anchor them into some of that chocolate dough. Put a little chocolate where you think you're going to anchor it, and then kind of plunge it into place. And eventually the chocolate will set and that will stay in place. It might take a couple of minutes. I think that shorter piece might look nice in the front, so I might reserve it for here. See if I can't get this bigger piece in here. I think I'm going to just put one more piece in the back. These chocolate pieces aren't snapping when I break them, which means they're a little warm, and that's because the room temperature here is warm. You want to work in a cool environment typically with chocolate. It's going to make your life a lot easier. Sometimes I will also come in with more white chocolate to anchor the chocolate in the back. We're going to hide this with beads. And that conceals kind of the mess at the bottom. And I, again, decorated with all the marbling facing forward. You could, of course, decorate in the round if you thought you were going to rotate these. So you could lay the beads more asymmetrically than I have. I've got mine going all the way around if you want. I'm just basically putting them, it's most important to put them wherever you want to hide any of the modeling chocolate or to add as added reinforcement. I got this on a longer piece of styrofoam because as soon as I get this piece on top, we're going to be laying it sideways to fill it. I don't want too much because I don't want it too much squeezing out the front. If it is, we can clean it up a little bit. So we're ready to assemble. I like to do that on its side. And to do that right now, since my spray is probably still a little bit moist because I did this rather recently, I like to prop it up. I like to lay it on the modeling chocolate on 2 little flat coffee stirrers just to elevate it so it's not resting directly on the sprayed area. So now we're ready to fill it. I'm going to toss in some berries. Actually, you could also do this while it's in the air, but I don't really like to hold this too long because I can disrupt the chocolate. So I'm going to throw some berries in. We might use a spoon or other tool to push them all the way down to the end. So I've just got whipped cream here, fresh out of the fridge, and I'm going to insert it as far as I can and pipe it just to the surface. Again, I don't want it interfering with my seam there. At this point, if the piece is rocking on you, you can also take supports. Sometimes I slide in these pieces. I just don't like them to touch the airbrushed area, and that'll keep it a little more stable. And then we'll stick on the nozzle. It sets pretty fast. I want to clean up any chocolate that's squeezed out while I can, trying to keep it off the red. So there she is finished. And now we just simply have to get it on a dessert plate and give it a try. So that completes our very beautiful and festive 4th of July firecracker made completely out of chocolate with the exception of the little tail on it, which is a cookie piece and completely edible as well. Many of you have asked me in the past why I don't eat my projects at the end of my videos, and there's a very practical reason for that most of the times, and that's simply because I also take photographs of them after I shoot the video, so I don't like to destroy them. But in this case, I made an extra firecracker or two, and I am going to humor you by cracking into this and completely destroying it. First, I'm going to move it onto a plate, and I don't know if it's going to fit this plate, so we may do some destruction in that process of moving it. Pretty good. I lost a little piece of the fire, but I think it looks quite nice. Let's see what we've got inside. Woo, there we go. Some mousse and berries, just delicious. And chocolate, of course. Till next video, live sweetly and have a great 4th of July.